Chapter 24 of Blacker Chief Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Blacker Chief Dick by Margery Allingham. Chapter 24. Ah, Master Gilbert, 'twill be a deal quieter than this tomorrow night, I reckon. Master Granger leaned across from his seat in the chimney corner and jerked his head in the direction of the body of the room where everything was in commotion. The Annie was due to sail on the night tide, and her crew were celebrating its departure with rum and song. One of the long tables had been pulled out, and round this some 10 or 12 men sprawled in more or less comfortable attitudes. Behind these were others sitting on rum kegs or leaning against the walls. They were all very merry, and from time to time loud shrieks of laughter shook the old ship's rafters and made them echo again and again. Round the flickering fire, the first of the season, but a bright one, sat the islanders. Joe Pullen, French, Sip de Mossett, Granger, Gilbot, and a few others. They did not mix with the roaring, yelling crowd of seamen, but sat stolidly, drinking slowly, talking slowly, and enjoying themselves after their own quiet fashion. Now and again, perhaps, a young man would leave his seat to go over and split a joke and a pint with a sailor, but the majority kept themselves to themselves, neither objecting to nor wholly approving the noisy pleasure of the smugglers. Hal especially was very taciturn. He stood quietly in a candle-lit corner, cleaning pewter, and spoke hardly at all. Sue, however, was in a very good humor, in her best kirtle, and her hair tied with a bow of scarlet ribbon, which French had given her. She flew hither and thither, carrying the liquor. Annie had not yet appeared, and Blue Neck nudged Noah Goody as they sat at the long table, when the time crept on, and still she did not come. Little Red sat on French's knee, keeping very still and listening to the conversation with the utmost interest. Granger's remark called forth a chorus of eyes, some disconsolate, but mostly cheerful. Gilbot looked at the reeling crowd out of the corners of his little red-rimmed eyes. Then he chuckled. "Nice," he said thickly. A weak, happy smile played over his big, puffy face. "Nice-o, very nice indeed. Let's have a song." And he struck up Mary Lou in a thin, quavering voice. At this moment the door was flung open, and a wave of cold air blew round the stifling kitchen. Several men from the table turned to swear at the intruder, but their mouths shut quietly, and they rose to their feet as they saw who it was. Blacker Chief Dick stepped lightly into the room, and shutting the door behind him, stood smiling on the company, a slim, dapper little figure in black velvet. Then he removed his black beaver and called loudly for liquor all round. His words were received with cheers, and once again the talk broke out, and the singing restarted. Dick perched himself on the end of one of the empty tables and looked about for Annie. The smile faded from his face when he saw she was not there, and a look of disappointment took its place. He had no doubt she was preparing to fly with him, but he had expected to see her waiting for him, her big eyes and wistful little face alight with expectation, and he flattered himself. Love. His vanity was hurt at her neglect. So his astonishment and anger when he saw her come in a few minutes later, in her usual kirtle and serving apron, an unwonted color in her cheeks, and a sparkle in her eyes, as she fluttered to and fro from one knot of seamen to another, leaving a smile here and a jest there, and a pert, stinging remark somewhere else, knew no bounds. He looked at her in amazement. She had not even glanced his way. The disappointed expression left his face, and a smile returned, but it was not the same smile. In the next half-hour Annie surpassed herself for gaiety. Her laugh rang out loud and clear almost every other second, and the whole company was at her feet in 10 minutes. Even old Gilbot noticed her, and wagging his head sagely, said that good lashes were good business. But for Dick she had no eyes. Not once did she meet his glance, bring his liquor, or come within 5 feet of him. At first his surprise kept him silent and grave, so that Blue Neck observed in a whisper to Goody that it was wont to be the lasses and not the captain who were grave when sailing time came, and that times had changed. But after a while Dick's smile grew more and more pronounced, and he called for rum again and again. Still Annie took no notice of him. Louder and louder grew her laugh, quicker and quicker her retorts, brighter her smile, and more numerous her admirers. Hal looked up from his pewter cleaning and sighed. "She was never so happy when we were sweethearts," he muttered. Only Sue looked at Annie strangely. She was a woman, and she knew that there was a false note in the girl's laughter, and that the light in her eyes was an almost desperate one. But she was an islander, and therefore another lass's business was none of hers, and she said nothing to her, nor to anyone else. At last the Spaniard could bear this lack of notice no longer, and raising his voice, called pleasantly enough, "Mistress Annie!" The girl started, and the tray of mugs which she was carrying rattled nervously. But she recovered herself in a second, and smiled radiantly at him. "Will your lordship wait till I put these down?" she said gaily, with mock deference. Dick's smile grew broader, and Blue Neck, who was watching him, whistled softly between his teeth, and nudged Goody again. "Not at all," Dick was saying, his voice very soft and caressing. Annie put down the tray with a clatter. "Oh, there now!" she exclaimed brightly. "If I haven't spilt 1/2 of Master French's sack, I must fill it up. Here, Hal, will you go to the captain for me while I do this? I know he likes being served quickly." Hal went over to him obediently. The Spaniard's eyelids flickered, and his smile broadened as he ordered more rum, planking down a Jacobus in payment. The time went on, and Gilbot and his customers grew more and more lively. Still Annie avoided the Spaniard, and still he sat on the table steadily drinking rum. Suddenly, in the middle of a song, Dick looked at the clock, and then, rising to his feet, shouted, "Get aboard, dogs!" The singing died away immediately, and all eyes were turned on the clock. The hands pointed to 8:15. Then a murmur rose among the crew, and one bolder than the rest said something about orders being 8:45. Dick sprang to his feet, and his hand played round the hilt of his knife. "A mutiny?" he asked softly. Instantly there was a shuffle toward the door, and they filed out one by one, and Gilbot, his fuddled brain just realizing that the merriment had suddenly died down, began to pipe cheerfully. "Oh, no one remembers poor Will, who stuck by his mate at the mill." Dick laughed and took it up, and the crew, glad to find him so easily recovered, joined in eagerly, and they filed off down the road, singing in chorus. He ground up more bones than barley or stones, and more than old Rowley could kill. More bones, more bones, more bones, more bones, more bones than old Rowley could kill. Ah, well, said Joe, rising to his feet as the last man reeled drunkenly out of the doorway. I reckon I'll be getting down to look at my boat. The others laughed. It was well known that the smugglers would commandeer any rowing boat that might come their way to take them to the brig, and like as not would set it adrift to be carried out to sea. "I'll go with ye, lad," said Granger, and they went out together. Most of the others followed, leaving only French, Red, and Siptimoset sitting with Gilbot round the fire. Annie and Sue stood by the door talking together, their backs to the Spaniard, while Hal went on cleaning pewter. Dick swaggered over to French. "Master French," he said softly, his beautiful voice very even and clear, "hadst thou not better go down to the brig and see to thy goods?" French looked up puzzled. "Goods?" he said wonderingly, and then added as he met the Spaniard's steady gaze, maybe I had," and got up hastily. Red caught hold of his hand. "Take me," he whispered. French looked down at him and laughed as he stroked his honey-coloured beard. "Come on, then, young 'un," he said kindly. Red whooped joyfully, and the big man and the little boy went to the door together. Sue slipped her arm into French's as he passed her. "I'll come a little way with ye, Ezekiel," she murmured. French put his arm about her, and they went out. Siptimoset then rose to his feet. "Are you coming, Captain?" he said, as he picked up his stick. Annie caught her breath as she edged round behind the empty table. Dick smiled sardonically. "I shall follow," he said. Sip looked about him and then smiled knowingly, and putting on his hat, went over to the door and out into the dark. Blackguard Chief Dick waited until he had gone, and then turned and faced Annie, who was watching him, fascinated. She felt that the time had come at last when she must shake him off forever, or else go with him. She had not heard from Nan since Red had taken her message, and she remembered the old woman's promise as the one gleam of hope on her horizon, and every moment she expected to see her hobble into the kitchen. But it was getting late, and Nan had not come. Dick walked over to the table behind which she stood, and seated himself upon it without speaking. The desperate light crept into the girl's eyes again, and she began to laugh. At least she must keep him in as good a temper as possible, she realized that. So, dropping a curtsy, she came a little nearer, and leaning over the table, she asked him would he drink again. To her surprise, he answered her very pleasantly that he would, and ordered rum. Hal, who was still cleaning pewter, looked up from his work and watched the little scene with a growing sense of despair. To know that his love was lost to him was bitter enough, he told himself. But to see her happy in the Spaniard's company, to see her hang upon the Spaniard's words and wait for his smile, was too much. He turned away quickly. When Annie came back with the rum, Dick caught her wrist and held her firm with one hand, while he raised the tankard to his lips with the other. "Why are you not ready to come with me?" he whispered, as he set down the empty rumkin. Annie began to laugh again. "Lord, how you talk, Captain," she said, trying to pull her arm from out his grasp. The Spaniard's grip tightened, and his smile grew more grim. "And this is not the time to jest," he said, his voice growing softer and more musical at every word. "The brig waits us." Annie noticed that his voice was gentle and began to giggle again. "Well, Master Dick, let it wait," she said, tossing her head. "It can wait till doomsday before you'll see me aboard," and she broke into a little nervous laugh. To her surprise, Dick joined in with her, and his long, low laugh echoed through the kitchen. Hal looked up quickly and then turned away, as though the sight had stung him, while Gilbot, thinking it was a signal for general joyfulness, began to sing again. "Pretty Poll, she loved a sailor, and well she loved he." "Peace, damn you, peace!" roared Dick, suddenly gripping Annie's arm so hard that she cried out. Gilbot sat spellbound. Never had anyone so spoken to him in his life before, and he was about to reply. But one look at the furious face of the little Spaniard calmed him, and he subsided, muttering, "No offense, no offense." This outburst had surprised Annie quite as much as Gilbot, and she looked at Dick with new fear. If only Nan would come, she thought. If only Nan would come. At this moment the door opened, and she turned eagerly, her eyes alight with hope. But it was Sue who came in softly, and sat down quietly by the fireside, opposite her uncle. Dick turned his head without letting Annie go, and called for more rum. Hal brought it, without looking at either of them, and set it on the table. The Spaniard drained it at a gulp. "So you will not come with me, my beautiful one," he said, still smiling, and leaning across the table toward the girl. Annie looked at him, and her spirits rose. He was only playing with her, after all, she thought, as she saw his dark eyes smiling at her. Yet she wished that Nan would come, although she was still vague in her mind as to what she expected the old woman to do when she did come. "Nay, sir," she said, smiling, "not this time." The Spaniard laughed again. "Not this time, my Anne? Not this time?" he questioned in an almost threatening note which crept into his laughing tone. "Here, boy, more rum," he called over his shoulder. Hal brought the liquor. The Spaniard drew his knife from his belt and held it up by the blade, so that the flickering light fell on its jeweled hilt. "'Tis a fair blade," he said admiringly. "Aye, it is," agreed Annie, as she took the rum from Hal, who nearly cried out as he saw her bright, eager face lifted to the foreigner's. Dick took the tankard and drained it. Then he began to smile again, and to twist the knife through and about his fingers with that peculiar smooth movement his crew knew so well. The girl watched him for a second, and then looked up at the clock. Why had not Nan come, she wondered. "'Tis late, Captain. You will miss the tide, and you do not hasten," she said. Dick's eyelids dropped a little lower over his dark eyes, but his knife slipped through his fingers with a faster motion than before. Yet still he smiled, and when he spoke, Annie thought she had never heard so beautiful a voice. "Ah, Senora, I would not leave the island without that jewel, which is mine by right," he said softly. "Oh, I had forgot," said Annie, feeling in her apron pocket. "Here is the ring, sir. I had it ready for you." And she drew out a little muslin packet, and unfolding it, disclosed the flowered ring which he had given her. She held it out to him. Sue, who had been watching them, gasped at the sight of such a jewel, and looked at Annie wonderingly. The girl was over lucky, she thought. Dick took the ring and slipped it over the blade of his knife. It slid up to the hilt, and there stuck a band of gold and gems round the blue steel. "You give it back to me," he said half to himself. "You give it back to me. No other woman has done so much," he added suddenly, looking at her with that peculiar smile playing round his lips. Then his voice dropped, and he said as though he had just realized something, "But to no other woman have I given so much." And he laughed again, unpleasantly and yet so musically, while the knife fairly sped through his slim, delicate fingers. Annie began to feel fairly sure of herself. Why should she wait for Nan to defy him, she thought. Here he was, laughing and playing. Surely there would be no danger in telling him the truth. She leaned a little nearer to him and said very softly, so that none of the others could hear, "I would you would go, sir. You have your ring. What else remains?" The knife paused for a while in its unending circle round the thin white hand. The dark lids flickered, and then the thin, twisted smile vanished, but only for a second. Then the soft voice said smoothly, "One thing, Anne, my Anne of the island, one thing remains that must come with me. That is my wife." Annie began to laugh again, nervously, but conquering herself, she said sharply, "Pest on ye, sir! Will ye never stop teasing a poor girl's life out? I tell you, I hate you, sir." Dick laughed softly, and there was a new note in his voice which no one could mistake, and Annie drew back a little. "You said so once before, sweet Anne," he said, "and I did not believe you then, as I do not now." Annie felt strangely irritated by his attitude, and bending still closer to him, said in a sharp half-whisper, "Oh, but, sir, you should. A man who woos unloved is a foolish sight in my eyes." Dick slipped his arm round her waist and held her fast. He was beginning to realize that he had at last come up against a will which would not bend before his own, and a wave of uncontrollable anger surged over him. His smile almost vanished for a moment, and the knife quivered in his hand. Annie took his silence as a sign that her words were prevailing with him, and determined to play her last card. "I love another one," she said softly, drawing away from him as she spoke. A ripple of laughter burst from the Spaniard's lips, and he held her closer to him. Hal looked up at the sound with a fierce light in his eyes. He made a step forward, but drew back again almost immediately. "The lass likes it," he thought mournfully. "The lass likes it." Yet he could not keep his eyes off the two. Annie pointed to the knife which was hanging before her, and looked into the dark, smiling face so near her own. "Put by thy knife, sir," she said pettishly. "It fears me." Once again Dick laughed. "Nay, 'tis a beautiful thing," he said, holding it in the palm of his hand, the point toward her. "Think you not so?" The girl shrank away, and he bent toward her. "You said you loved another, mistress," he said suddenly, fiercely. "Is it truth?" Annie smiled at him fearlessly. "Aye, sir, truth," she said quietly. The Spaniard's smile returned, and the blue knife with the gold band on it seemed suddenly to have become part of his hand, as with a deft movement he laid the bright steel against the girl's bosom. Hal and Sue leaned forward to see this new foolery of the captain's, each thinking that his love-making was a little too open to be decent. "Oh, my sweet one, how fair my blade looks against thy white breast," said Dick, his eyes holding Annie's. "You gave me back my ring, but I am generous. See, I give it back to you." With the last words, the knife seemed suddenly to quicken and spring from his hand, and Annie staggered back from the table, her hand clasped to her breast. "Oh, how you hurt me, sir!" she said simply, the smile still on her lips and her cheeks still bright with the excitement of a moment before. Then her eyes closed, and she dropped onto the floor, the little thud her body made on the stone flags echoing all round the kitchen like a thunderclap. And the knife Blacker Chief Dick held was red blood up to the hilt. He looked at it dazedly, a horrified expression on his usually inscrutable face. "Dead," he said hoarsely, his voice sounding old and strained in the intense silence. "She is sure to be dead. We have never struck twice." But his voice sank to a whisper. "At last we have struck too soon." He passed his hand over his forehead and gazed fixedly in front of him. Some of the blood which had spurted off the knife onto his hand now smeared his forehead. Save for this, his face was ashy pale. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he walked to the door, opened it, and went out. For a second the kitchen was in perfect silence, and then a scream as high and despairing as a woman's rang out loud and clear in the suddenly cold room, and Hal Graham, his boyish face distorted with rage and horror, flung himself across the kitchen and out after the Spaniard. The night was an exceedingly dark one, and Nan Swale stumbled once or twice over the loose stones in her path as she strode over the rough track which ran from her shanty to the ship. Many strange thoughts came to her as she passed on through the darkness, her tall, gaunt figure straining against the wind, and her ragged garments flying like streamers out behind her. The bitter memory of her last encounter with Pet Salt still rankled with her, and the thought of Annie's enforced marriage to the Spaniard made her hate the other old woman more deeply than before. She had sworn to Annie that she would prevent her sailing with Dick, and it was to fulfill this promise that she was striding through the night, to prevent Dick from carrying off Annie. Nan had thought over her self-allotted task very carefully, and to her there seemed but one way to accomplish it. She had decided to take that way, and as she hastened on, her thin brown fingers gripped her long staff fiercely, and from time to time she stopped to feel the heavy round stone, which was bound to the top of it, making a once harmless walking stick a formidable weapon. On she went, her head held high, and her sharp eyes fixed ahead, as if she were seeking to pierce the darkness which closed in all around her. "They do not sail till 11, she muttered, and she would not go at once. I shall be in time to catch them as they come out of the yard. Aye, that is it, as they come out of the yard. It is dark there." And mumbling to herself, she clambered through a gap in the hedge and stumbled out into the ship lane. She had now a very little way to go, and her grip on her staff tightened as she hurried on. A sharp bend in the road brought her in sight of the ship. She could see the lights from the kitchen gleaming through the trees. She pressed on for a few more yards, and then stopped suddenly, and holding her breath, stood rigid for a second, listening. There was silence everywhere, and the old woman shifted uneasily. "No noise?" she muttered. "No noise? What has come to the ship on sailing night that all should be so still?" Keeping her eyes fixed on the lighted window, she hastened on to the yard gates. There she paused again. The ship was silent as before, and then as she stood there watching, the door opened, and a slim figure stood silhouetted against the bright background for a second and then staggered out toward her. Without further thought, Nan strode forward, her staff upraised. Hardly had she moved, however, when Hal's terrible scream rang out through the open doorway. The old woman sprang forward, a faint inkling of what had happened flashing through her mind. Dick did not see her until she was almost on top of him. He came across the yard dazed and horrified, conscious of one thing only, that in a fit of rage he had killed the one woman he had ever loved. The knife, still sticky and uncleaned, hung from his fingers, and the light from the window fell upon it as Nan came up to him. When he saw her dark form and shining eyes rising up before him out of the darkness, he started back, bringing his hands up before his face. Nan seized her opportunity and, without a thought of the possible consequences, dropped her staff, and, darting forward, wrenched the knife out of his nerveless grasp and plunged at his throat. Nan was a strong woman, and the knife, glancing on the Spaniard's collarbone, turned and slipped down into his neck, cutting the jugular vein. A choking exclamation, "Donna Maria!" fell from his lips. A rush of blood stifled all other words, and he dropped on the dry stones as dead as the girl he had left in the ship's kitchen. Nan heard them and laughed bitterly. "Maria," she muttered, "you may well call on her. Here, this is thine. Take that with thee to hell, you slithering coward." And bending down, she slipped the twice-stained knife into the slim white fingers. Then she straightened her back, and looking up, became aware of Hal Graham's tall figure standing not 2 feet away, his eyes fixed upon her. They stood quite still for several seconds, neither speaking, and then Gilbot hurried out of the door. The shock had sobered him for once in his life. Seeing Hal, he broke out excitedly. "Have you seen him, lad? Have you caught him? Where is the ruffian?" Still Hal did not speak, but catching the old man by the arm, he pointed silently to the still figure at their feet. The stream of light from the open doorway fell across the Spaniard's face and the white hand which held the knife. Gilbot bent down for a moment, and when he looked up, his face was even paler than the boy's. "Who? What? What happened?" he whispered. Hal looked silently at Nan. The old woman faced him without flinching. "As I came up the road, I see him come out of the door waving his arms, and then suddenly drop like a sack. When I come up to him, he was like this," she said. "He killed hisself, I reckon," she added carelessly. Old Gilbot looked down at the huddled form. "'Twas just what I feared when I come to the door," he muttered. "Lord, what things men do because o' wenches! And in my house, too. What's to happen now?" End of chapter 24.